Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast. This audio podcast as part of the Photon Saga. This audio podcast as part of the Ghromulin series. This audio podcast as part of a Storm Robotics production. In today's audio podcast as part of this Storm Robotics production, a look at a look at a, s- a look at I look at ischaemic reperfusion injury in regard to in regard to ischaemia and reperfusion in a form of a schematic and works in a form of a schematic and which have been published in pharmacological reviews in around 2007 by authors Ferdinandi and team from around 2007, and again in around pharmacological reviews in a publication looking at interaction of cardiovascular risk factors with myocardial ischemia reperfusion injury, preconditioning and post conditioning. And in the public in the within the publication which I would signpost to listeners and viewers in around this in around this it is a publication a publication that generally has a sort of a pharmacological basis, a sort of pharmacological basis. However, within the published works by Ferdinandi and team from 2007, there is a schematic that looks at ischemia and reperfusion. Looks at ischemia reperfusion, and before going into aspects of the schematic, ischemia reperfusion injury may lead to a myocardial infarction, cardiac arrhythmias, and contractile dysfunction. Ischemic preconditioning of a myocardium is also a well described adaptive sort of response in which brief exposure to ischemia and reperfusion before sustained ischemia markedly enhances the ability of the myocardium of the heart cells to withstand a subsequent ischemic insult. Additionally, the application of brief repetitive episodes of ischemia reperfusion at the immediate onset of reperfusion has been terminologied as post conditioning, which reduces the extent of reperfusion injury. And ischemic pre and post conditioning sort of share some, but not all parts of the signal transduction cascade, including the activation of survival protein kinase pathways. And most experimental investigations at the same time are in around cardio protection in around cardio pharmacotherapies have been undertaken through animal investigations in which ischemic reperfusion is imposed in the absence of other disease sort of processes. So in as part of the schematic, and again the schematic is originally published through the works of Ferdinandi and team from 2007, around 2007, and the schematic looks a little bit like this. So just to hold this up to the screen if I can. Uh, So that's the sort of although listeners and viewers may not be able to see that properly, it is a sort of a brief sort of a brief look at the schematic. And to describe this schematic, describe this sort of schematic is where initially initially around the concept of ischaemia-reperfusion injury by post conditioning is where initially there's where, for example, there's ischaemia, there's ischaemia, and then ischaemia itself is introduced through, for example, contractile dysfunction, arrhythmias, and myocardial infarction. Severity of ischaemia and reperfusion injury is influenced by any of, for example, any of those initial factors. So where there is ischaemia, there is then a sort of there is then sort of a sense of alleviation, which sort of unblocks the unblocks sort of where ischaemia exists, and thus where there is then where alleviation takes place, takes place, there is then an increase an increase in blood flow. Additionally, ischaemia-reperfusion injury by post-conditioning, where cardio protection where cardio protection where cardio protection is has a base has an underpinning. There is also a basis where cardio protection in around the concept of ischaemia-reperfusion injury by post conditioning is where cardio protection increases contractile function, decreases arrhythmias, and also decreases infarct size. Cardio protection by post conditioning is a sort of is a sort of a major where there can be major factors factors along to sort of primary conditions that interfere that interfere with cardio protection conferred by pre and post conditioning. So in the schematic in the schematic it is where, for example, there's a sort of a sort of interconnectivity or sort of interconnectivity or interlinking between ischaemia and reperfusion. That is where, for example, again, there's a lack of blood flow, but then if that lack of blood flow is alleviated by by a form of pharmacotherapy, or by for example a surgical entity, for example, there is then reperfusion. But again in literature to inform listeners and viewers that reperfusion can also unfortunately cause a sense of sort of exasperated sort of tissue injury at the same time. However, in more recent literature, there is and have been sort of advances in around pharmacotherapies and surgical procedures, for example, that can actually better sort of better sort of the better sort of the human the sort of human physiology or pathophysiology in around ischaemia-reperfusion injury and through post conditioning. So that draws this audio podcast to a close. This audio podcast as part of a Photon Saga. This audio podcast as part of the Ghromulin series, and this audio podcast as part of a Storm Robotics production.